Hercule Poirot and the Music Nobody Heard. Chapter 1. A Note to the Wind. Fog hung like a veil over the small coastal village of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, where waves crashed lazily against the stone cliffs. It was a grey and damp April morning when tragedy struck the quiet community in the form of an unexplained death. Mrs. Isadora Bellamy, renowned retired pianist and widow of the eccentric English composer Ambrose Bellamy, was found dead in the living room of her mansion, Villa Nocturne. Her body lay slumped next to the Steinway grand piano, one hand still dangling from the keys, as if she had been about to play a final note. The local doctor, Émile Giraud, pronounced her death sudden due to an aneurysm. However, the deceased's young niece, Colette Arnaud, was not convinced. It was she who, with trembling hands, called an old family acquaintance, the famous Belgian detective Hercule Poirot. "Monsieur Poirot, I beg you to come. It's not just my aunt's death. It's everything that came before. The sleepless nights, the constant fear, that melody. That damned melody you said you heard when no one was home." Poirot, intrigued by the combination of sudden death, inaudible music and mounting anxiety in a woman who had always controlled her environment with an iron fist, agreed to travel from Paris to the Normandy coast. Upon arrival, Poirot found himself confronted by a scene of elegant desolation. The Villa Nocturne, perched on a cliff, was a neo-Gothic structure with tall stained-glass windows and a perpetual air of melancholy. A mute housekeeper named Bernadette greeted the detective and led him to the drawing-room where Isadora had been found dead. The atmosphere was strange. There was no indication of a struggle, no obvious signs of poisoning or intrusion. However, Poirot frowned when he noticed the position of the body, the open sheet music on the piano stand, a piece by Ambrose Bellamy that had never been published, and the grandfather clock stopped at 11:47. "What time did Dr. Giraud say your death occurred?" Poirot asked Colette, who was accompanying him, her eyes still red from crying. "He thinks it was after midnight, but the clock was like that when I found her this morning, and the window was ajar, even though it was cold." Poirot didn't reply immediately. He walked slowly around the piano, touching the back of the chair with his fingers, observing the carpet, the marks on the floor, the dust. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet the absolute order unsettled him. "And this piece," he asked, pointing at the score, "is called Nocturne for an Absent Soul. It's not published. It's one of the compositions my uncle wrote in his later years. Aunt Isadora said it should never be played, that it brought with it the memory of silence, as she put it. Curious." Poirot nodded with interest. Music that no one was meant to hear. A piece whose performance coincided with a death no one witnessed. "Mademoiselle, tell me, who else lives in this house?" "Besides me and Bernadette, there are 3 other people. Mr. Lucien Vauclair, my aunt's personal secretary, Miss Mireille Lemoine, her former student who now works as a companion, and Mr. Dorian Bellamy, my Uncle Ambrose's son, though only from his first marriage." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Ah, a fragmented inheritance, a house full of silent music, and 4 souls who perhaps, just perhaps, haven't told us everything. Well, mademoiselle, it's time for Poirot to put his little grey cells to work." And so, with a slight bow, and a gaze that scanned every shadow in the room, the investigation began that would reveal not only a crime, but also the hidden melody of a life built on deception. Chapter 2. The Inhabitants of Nocturne Village. Poirot requested that everyone present in the house be gathered in the conservatory, a glass-enclosed room overlooking the sea, with a majestic view of the cliff. The dim light of the evening filtered through the steamed windows, giving the meeting a spectral air. There, beneath the withered vines and manicured orchids, the Belgian detective began his silent observation of the villa's inhabitants. Lucien Vauclair, the deceased's personal secretary, was a thin, angular man with perfectly combed-back hair and round glasses that accentuated his air of precision. He stood erect, hands clasped behind his back, as if standing before a tribunal. Madame Bellamy was exacting, he said in a monotone when Poirot asked him about his relationship with the deceased. But she was fair. I took care of her correspondence, her social calendar. He said this as if such activities had been military, not musical. And where were you last night? In my room, preparing the will she asked me to type that morning. I never got around to giving it to her. It's still on my desk. Poirot nodded briefly, without comment. Then he turned to young Mireille, Lemoine, who sat cross-legged, nervously touching the gold chain around her neck. She was about 25 years old, with lively but shifty eyes, and the restrained elegance of someone accustomed to the presence of important people, but not entirely part of their world. Madame Bellamy let me stay here for a year. I played the piano with her. Some nights, she'd stay in the parlour, alone, playing music I'd never heard before, strange music like broken dreams. Did you hear her play last night? No, I didn't leave my room. I was sick. Poirot didn't press the question. He just looked down at the young woman's nails, hastily painted, some with marks of chipped polish. A minor detail, nothing more, like a broken note in a symphony. Finally, it was Dorian Bellamy's turn. Tall, handsome, dressed in a blue linen jacket and silk scarf, he had the relaxed demeanour of someone unafraid of consequences. His light eyes, however, concealed something colder. My father abandoned my mother for Isidora. Does that mean anything to you, Monsieur Poirot? We were never a happy family. And yet here it is, by the will, of course. My father disinherited me. But Isidora promised to reconsider. She said she wanted to right past mistakes. I guess she didn't make it in time. And his alibi? I was outside, walking along the cliff. Can anyone confirm that? Probably not. But I'm not interested in theatre. I didn't kill anyone. Poirot silently observed the four. Colette, mute, remained in a corner, huddled together, as if she could still hear her aunt's melody floating in the air. Bernadette, the housekeeper, stood behind a door, attentive to everything, but without intervening. "Thank you," Poirot said, at last, with a slight bow. "You will excuse me, messieurs et mesdames. There is much that is said, but also much that is not." When everyone had dispersed, Poirot remained in the greenhouse, contemplating the wet footprints Dorian had left on the floor when he entered. Then, without looking at anyone, he muttered, "A house can hide many things, but not silence where there should have been music." And with that, He walked back into the living room alone, determined to inspect the piano again. Chapter 3. The Incomplete Score. The room was plunged into an almost unnatural stillness, as if death still lingered in the room, invisible but present. Poirot entered silently and approached the piano. His meticulously manicured fingers brushed the closed lid before gently lifting it. The black and white keys seemed untouched, except for a faint stain on the far right, a barely perceptible imprint, as if someone had pressed it with a wet hand. The score of Nocturne for an absent soul Poirot examined it closely. The notation was dense, complex, with unusual modulations that spoke of a tormented spirit. In the lower right-hand corner, however, he noticed something peculiar, a crossed-out measure, and beneath it, written in a different ink, a single word in Old French. Remember, Poirot frowned. The note seemed to have been added recently. Had Isidora herself altered the piece, or had someone else intervened without her knowledge? He turned to survey his surroundings. To one side of the piano, on a small walnut table, sat a reading lamp, a half-empty wine-glass, and a small notepad. The pad had only one page of writing on it. On it, in firm but hurried handwriting, was the following: "If anyone plays that music, it will all come back. They mustn't listen to it. They mustn't—" The sentence was cut off abruptly. Poirot took the note carefully, and at that moment the door creaked behind him. It was Colette. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," she said softly. "I just wanted to be here for a moment. It was your favourite space." Poirot nodded, still not speaking back. His gaze rested on the young woman's face. She looked exhausted, as if she hadn't slept in days. There was more than just sadness in her expression. There was fear. "Mademoiselle Arnaud," he said finally, "you mentioned in your letter that your aunt heard a melody that no one else could. Could you explain that to me?" Colette hesitated for a moment before speaking. "It started a few weeks ago. She said that at night, after everyone was asleep, she heard a melody downstairs. It was always the same. I didn't hear anything, but I found her many times at the piano, trembling. She said it wasn't her playing. It was Ambrose. Do you think your aunt was becoming unstable? No. Her mind was as clear as ever, but she seemed haunted, obsessed, as if she were afraid the music would reveal something she'd kept buried for years." Poirot walked to the window, where the sea breeze was gently blowing through the crack. He closed the door with precision. "Was there enmity between your aunt and Dorian Bellamy?" "She said Dorian was an opportunist. She never trusted him. But a few days ago, I thought I saw them talking on the terrace. They seemed calm. Too calm, considering their history." Poirot narrowed his eyes. His mind was beginning to weave threads, but the fabric was still incomplete. There was music, yes, but there were also strategic silences. Too many. "Thank you, mademoiselle. Please don't leave the villa without letting me know." She nodded and walked away with soft steps. Poirot returned to the piano and played the first notes of the score with a single finger. They sounded melancholic, unsteady, almost like a lament. And yet there was something familiar about the sequence. A signature, perhaps, A coded message. He slammed the piano shut. "No," he murmured. "This piece wasn't written just to be heard. It was written to be remembered." And with that suspicion, the detective headed to Lucien Vauclair's study. He wanted to see that unfinished will. The unsigned words could say as much as the signed ones. Chapter 4. The Incomplete Testament. The villa's study was located at the back of the house, where the view of the sea was replaced by a small camellia garden. Poirot entered unannounced and found Lucien Vauclair sitting behind a dark desk, organizing envelopes with almost obsessive meticulousness. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," he said without looking up. "I thought you'd come." "You are a perceptive man, Monsieur Vauclair, perhaps even more so than you would like to appear." Vauclair smiled stiffly and pointed to a pile of papers on the desk. "The will. I typed it just as she dictated it to me. But she didn't get a chance to sign it. I left it on my desk last night, and this morning it was still there, untouched." Poirot sat opposite him, carefully crossing one leg over the other. And what exactly did it contain? Substantial modifications. I wished to revoke the previous document. In this version, I named my niece Colette as the principal heir to the villa, the piano, her husband's manuscripts, the entire artistic estate. I assigned Dorian a modest sum, and I received compensation for my years of service. Miss Miret was not listed. Poirot raised an eyebrow. No mention of Miss Lemoine. "None," Vauclair repeated, this time with a slight inflection. Something between contempt and satisfaction. The detective asked to read the document. He did so slowly, as if every word could betray a lie. He noticed the absence of strike-throughs, the neatness of the writing, but in the lower right corner, the space designated for the signature remained blank. However, there was one detail that didn't escape his eyes. A very faint, almost imperceptible stain at the bottom of the page. An elongated drop, like ink or red wine. "Were you drinking while writing it?" "Never." Lucien straightened. "I don't drink alcohol while working, not even socially." Poirot nodded, feigning agreement. And who else had access to this office? Just me. Mrs. Bellamy had a key, but she didn't usually go in. "And last night? Were you here?" "No. I finished the will and retired to my chambers, as I told you." Poirot was silent for a few seconds before changing his tone. "Tell me, Monsieur Vauclair, did you know the piece? Nocturne for an Absent Soul?" Lucien hesitated only slightly, a hesitation so subtle that anyone but Poirot would have missed it. "In name only. I know Monsieur Bellamy composed it during a very dark period in his life. Madame forbade it from being played in public. She said it evoked things that should be forgotten. And yet the score was on the piano last night. I couldn't tell you how he got there." Poirot stood up slowly. "Funny, isn't it? A forbidden piece of music, an unfinished will, a stain where there shouldn't be one, and a secretary who knows too much, or too little." Lucien frowned, but Poirot had already turned towards the door. Before leaving, the detective stopped. "One last question. Were you a musician, Monsieur Vauclair?" "No, not at all." Poirot smiled. "Then you won't mind me analysing the piano's contents. Sometimes the keys hide more than they reveal." And without further ado, he walked out into the living room, leaving Lucien motionless, his gaze fixed on the will, as if he feared that this unsigned paper could still change his destiny. Chapter 5. The Silent Keys. Poirot returned to the living room with a measured gait, as if every tile on the floor needed to be inspected. The piano remained, in the same place, seemingly unchanged. But now, after what he had heard in the office, something about its stillness seemed feigned. He sat down in front of the instrument, let his fingers hover over the keys, and struck a note. It sounded clean and clear, then another, and another, until, upon reaching one of the intermediate keys, an A-flat, there was barely a muffled click. Poirot repeated the gesture. The note sounded, but with a slight delay, a minuscule resistance, as if something were obstructing its operation. He gently lifted the lid. Inside, between the hammers, was something embedded, a small object wrapped in paper. With tweezers, he carefully extracted it. It was a thin gold chain, and as it unwrapped itself from the paper that concealed it, it revealed a round, smooth pendant with no inscriptions. Poirot held it up to the light. The paper wrapped around it was neatly folded. When he opened it completely, he discovered that it wasn't just any paper, but a letter, very short, handwritten in a nervous hand. "Inunto, anyone finds this, let them know the truth. I didn't compose that piece. It was Ambrose, the last, the cruelest, and now it returns, but not from the pentagram, but from guilt, unsigned, undated." Poirot studied the back. The ink was smudged, as if it had been written with trembling hands, or with tears, and the pendant, though simple, had a barely perceptible hinge. When he opened it with a soft click, he found inside a carefully arranged lock of light brown hair. At that moment, the drawing-room door opened abruptly. It was Mireille Lemoine. Seeing what Poirot was holding, her face paled. "Where did you find that?" he asked, not hiding his agitation. "Hidden in a silent key, mademoiselle. A very intimate hiding-place." She took a step back. That pendant belonged to Madame Bellamy. She always carried it with her. She said it was a memento from her youth. Of youth? Or of something that should remain hidden? Mireille looked at him suspiciously. Her voice was now tense and measured. "Are you implying that she—" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just observing. And I noticed that someone placed that object inside the piano. Not by chance, but intentionally. Was it you, perhaps?" "Of course not," he retorted. "Do you think I'd sneak into the living room at night to hide a medallion inside the piano?" Poirot nodded slightly. "Precisely because it seems unlikely. That's why I wonder." She turned around and left without saying goodbye. Poirot looked again at the open pendant. The lock of hair didn't seem to belong to Isidora. It was lighter, more youthful, perhaps a younger woman's, or a girl's. He carefully closed the locket. Inside, a melody lingered. Not the one sounding from the piano, but another. A melody of memories, of unspoken secrets, of silences too dense to be accidental. Poirot muttered to himself, "Miss Lemoine isn't telling the whole truth, and this pendant could be the key to a story older than the crime itself." The music that no one heard was perhaps not only on the music sheet, but in what had been silenced for too many years. Chapter 6. Echoes in the midnight night fell upon the Villa Nocturne, enveloped in an eerie silence, broken only by the distant murmur of the waves. Poirot did not retire to his room. Instead, he remained in the darkened drawing-room, sitting in a high-backed armchair, the pendant still in his pocket and the score on his knees. He no longer read the notes. He meditated on them, as if the true meaning lay not in the melody, but in the rhythm of the silences. Just after midnight, a faint creaking sound alerted him. It came from the corridor. Poirot didn't move, but his eyes opened with absolute alertness. The footsteps were cautious, like those of someone who didn't wish to be overheard. Then the figure of a woman crossed the entrance to the drawing-room. She was wearing a light-coloured dressing gown, and her hair tied back. It was Colette. She didn't see him. She walked over to the piano and placed something on the music stand. A new sheet of paper with empty lines. Then, with slightly trembling hands, she struck 3 notes, the same ones with which the Nocturne for an Absent Soul. But this time there was no melody, just a pause. Colette closed her eyes as if waiting for something, or someone, to respond. "Did you expect it to ring alone, mademoiselle?" said Poirot gently, emerging from the gloom. She flinched, backing away quickly. "Monsieur Poirot! No, I didn't know you were here. Forgive the theatrics, but I found it interesting to observe what happens in this house when everyone thinks the detective is asleep." She looked down, embarrassed. "I didn't come here to do anything wrong." "And what did he do, exactly?" Colette hesitated before answering. Then, in a low voice, she confessed, "My aunt told me that if I ever heard the melody, I should write it down, even if I didn't hear it with my ears, to trust my memory or my blood." Poirot frowned slightly. "Your blood?" She believed Ambrose's music was hereditary, that some of his genius or his madness ran in the blood. Sometimes she told me I was more Ambrose's daughter than he was. "Did you mean Dorian?" Colette nodded slowly. "He never accepted it. He said he only wanted the legacy, but didn't understand the art." Poirot approached the piano. "And you? Do you understand?" She looked at the keys with a mixture of longing and fear. "I'm sorry, but I don't know if that's the same thing." Poirot remained silent for a few seconds. Then he picked up the blank sheet of paper she had left and held it up to the light. It was clean, except for a tiny mark in the corner, an almost invisible trace of dark ink, as if the sheet had been used before and then carefully cleaned. "Mademoiselle, was this sheet on your desk?" "No. I found it in one of my aunt's drawers, with other old scores. Poirot kept the sheet. Thank you. I'll ask you, however, not to repeat this. Nighttime visit. Someone else might not have my good manners." Colette lowered her head and walked away without reply. When silence fell again, Poirot placed a hand on the closed lid of the piano. "A daughter without a name, a melody without a listener, a crime without a weapon," he murmured. "What if we're not looking for a killer, but for a truth that someone killed years ago?" At the end of the corridor, something creaked again. This time, Poirot didn't get up. He simply closed his eyes for a moment. The music that no one heard. Perhaps it was never meant to be heard, but to be understood. Chapter 7. The Legacy of Silence. The next morning, Poirot requested a private meeting with Dorian Bellamy. He found him in the library, leafing uninterestedly through a book of old sheet music, which, judging by the way he turned the pages, he clearly didn't understand. "Monsieur Bellamy," said Poirot, entering without ceremony, "I'd like to ask you a few more questions about your father." Dorian closed the book reluctantly. "Aren't you digging into things that are too old? Maybe. But sometimes, to understand a present-day crime, you have to decipher a past truth." Dorian sighed and leaned back in the chair. "Very well. What do you want to know? What was your relationship with Ambrose Bellamy?" "None. After the divorce from my mother, we barely saw each other. He sent me money from time to time. A kind of penance, I suppose. But affection? None." Poirot nodded slowly. "And with Isidora? He despised me. From day one. He said I was a shadow, a disruption in Ambrose's masterpiece. Why then did you agree to come to the village?" "Because he wrote to me. He told me he was reconsidering the will. He wanted to talk about my inheritance. He seemed friendlier than usual. I thought maybe the years had softened his judgment. What a mistake." Poirot approached the desk. On it lay a framed photograph. Ambrose Bellamy in his youth, standing next to a woman with an oval face and light hair. It wasn't Isidora. Who is this woman? Dorian looked at him sideways. "My mother. Camille Laurent, French. She died years ago." Poirot nodded, studying the woman's face. There was something familiar about the expression. Then he looked at the frame behind it. A name was engraved. "To Camille, for the light I miss." Was your father sentimental? Only in music. In real life he was cruel, capricious, a genius, yes, but the kind who destroys everything he touches. Poirot turned to him. "Do you think Ambrose would have been capable of hiding a secret as big as an illegitimate daughter?" Dorian tensed. "What's that about?" "To the music, to the last composition, to the woman who died beside her piano, fearing the return of a melody that was never meant to be heard, and to a young woman who resembles, more than you think, that photograph in the frame." The silence between them thickened. "Are you implying that Colette—" "I'm not implying, I'm asking. And I notice you've wondered about it too." Dorian stood up abruptly. "My father was a coward, capable of many things. If he had another daughter, I wouldn't be surprised, but that has nothing to do with what happened here." Poirot watched him for a few seconds, then bent down and picked up from the floor a small object that had fallen without Dorian noticing. A golden earring, shaped like a musical note. "Is this yours?" "No." Dorian took it quickly. "I found it in the hallway last night. I thought it was Mireille's." Poirot smiled gently. "Maybe I should ask her. Although, in my experience, earrings don't go missing for no reason, especially in a house where everyone seems to have been up in the middle of the night." As he left, Poirot allowed himself a moment of reflection. Ambrose had left a legacy, yes, but it wasn't just compositions or notes on staves. He had left open wounds, buried truths, and inherited silences. And now, a melody, silent but insistent, returned to claim its place. Chapter 8. The Missing Name. Poirot left the library without, Another word and went down the villa's central corridor, whose walls now felt narrower, as if the house itself were holding its breath. He stopped in front of the half-open door to the music room, attracted by a faint sound. A key, pressed with extreme softness. He entered silently. Mireille Lemoine was sitting at the piano, staring at the score of Nocturne for an Absent Soul. Her fingers were no longer touching the keys. They merely skimmed them, as if she were afraid of awakening something sleeping beneath them. When she noticed Poirot's presence, she started, but she didn't move. "I haven't slept," she said softly. "The melody haunts me, and I haven't even heard it all the way through." "Music has that power, mademoiselle, especially if it's composed to say what can't be said." She finally looked at him. "What have you come for this time, Monsieur Poirot? To interrogate me as if I had killed Isidora?" Poirot shook his head gently. "No, I came to ask you about something deeper than the crime. I came to ask you about the truth." Mireille abruptly closed the score. "The truth is, this house is a disguised tomb. There's no music here, only echoes, and secrets no one dares to write." Poirot approached the piano. "You knew about the existence of an illegitimate daughter, right?" She hesitated for only a moment. "I suspected it. I saw things. I heard things. Isidora was jealous, possessive. Everything must have revolved around her and Ambrose. But there were letters, old letters she kept locked away. Where are those letters now? They disappeared weeks ago, and after that everything changed. Isidora became paranoid. She had the windows closed at night, put on new locks. I kept wondering if someone had broken into the studio. And you? Did you come in?" Mireille looked at him coldly. "I had no reason." Poirot took the earring out of his pocket and placed it on the music stand. "Is this yours?" The young woman took it slowly. Her face hardened. "Yes, I had lost it. I thought I had left it in my room. He was found in the hallway near Lucien Vauclair's office during the night." Mireille clenched her fist. "I didn't go there to steal anything. I wanted to know if she'd left me anything. After so many years of loyalty, of accompanying her, of playing with her, I thought I deserved it." "And did you find anything?" "Nothing. Just legal papers, names. But there was something strange. An open envelope with a typed list. People's names. And one of them was crossed out." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Do you remember the name?" She nodded. "Clémence Arnaud. I'd never heard of it before, but when I saw that last name, I thought of Colette." Poirot didn't reply immediately. He went to the window and looked out onto the garden, where the dawn mist was beginning to dissipate. "Mademoiselle," he said finally, "I would be grateful if you would not leave the villa under any circumstances. This mystery is closer to being solved than you think." And without waiting for an answer, he walked out with a firm step. The crossed-out name was the key, a name buried in time. Clémence Arnaud, an echo older than music, a link between two generations, an identity erased, to protect or to hide a betrayal. Poirot now knew where he had to go, not to the piano, but to the past. Chapter 9. The Composer's Lost Daughter. That afternoon, Poirot requested that no one interrupt him. He locked himself in the study with a box of personal correspondence found in a high cupboard in Isadora's bedroom. Colette, visibly worried, had mentioned its existence without giving it too much importance. But Poirot, always attentive to what it was said, that he suspected that there might be found what they had tried so hard to hide. The box was full of old letters, postcards from Paris, short telegrams. Ambrose Bellamy's handwriting appeared in many of them, along with another, more delicate and feminine one, Camille Laurent, the same woman in the portrait Dorian had indifferently shown. But there, among the yellowed envelopes, Poirot found what he was looking for, a letter dated 1913, signed by Camille, addressed to Isadora. Dear Isadora, I know you never accepted my existence, but this time I'm not writing for myself. It's for Clémence. Ambrose saw her. He took her in his arms, and in his eyes I saw something he never showed me. Tenderness. He said he was sorry, that he wanted to do the right thing. I beg you, if something ever happens, don't let the girl grow up without knowing her truth. It's not shameful. It's pure music, like the kind he used to compose when he still had a soul. Poirot carefully put the letter away and leaned back in his chair. Clémence Arnaud, the crossed-out name. The name someone had tried to erase from family history. But the surname Arnaud wasn't a coincidence. It was the same as Colette's. Poirot requested an immediate conversation with her. He found her in the garden, silently gazing out to sea, wrapped in a blanket that seemed too thin for the coastal cold. Her eyes were red, not from crying, just from being alert. I need you to tell me the truth, mademoiselle, Poirot began bluntly. Who was your mother? Colette looked puzzled. My mother died when I was a child. Her name was Jeanne Arnaud. We lived in Lyon. I heard she was a distant cousin of Isadora. That's why she accepted me here when I was orphaned. Poirot stared at her. Did you never ask him? Did you never suspect? Sometimes. Isadora was ambiguous. She called me her living memory. But she never explained what she meant. Poirot took out Camille Laurent's letter and handed it to her. Colette read it slowly. At first her face was only confusion, then surprise, and finally a deep shudder. Clémence. Was she my mother? Clémence mother. Jeanne Arnaud was a made-up name. Her mother was the daughter of Camille Laurent. And Ambrose Bellamy. You're not a niece, you're her direct granddaughter. Colette said nothing. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. Why hide it? Because destroying Ambrose's image as a tormented genius was something Isadora would never have allowed. And because acknowledging you meant sharing a legacy, Isadora wished to keep sealed, like a sealed piano. And do you think this has to do with his death? Poirot nodded gravely. I think someone, upon discovering who you really are, felt threatened by what you represent, by what you might inherit. And by music. Music. He nocturned for an absent soul. It wasn't a farewell. It was a confession. A work written for a daughter who had never been acknowledged. Her mother. The piece was dedicated to her. And now, whoever plays it, whoever hears it, also hears the truth. Colette closed her eyes. So all this time, the music did speak. Only no one wanted to hear it. Poirot stood up calmly. The killer wanted to silence that melody, but he forgot that blood, like music, lingers. And with that, Poirot returned to the house. He knew what he had to do. All that was left was one meeting, and the pieces would fall one by one, like notes in their final place. Chapter 10. The Final. Meeting. At dusk, Poirot asked all the inhabitants of Villa Nocturne to gather in the drawing-room. The atmosphere was charged, as if the walls themselves sensed that something was about to break. Dorian Bellamy arrived first, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Lucien Vauclair, immaculate as ever, sat by the fireplace without saying a word. Mireille Lemoine entered with visible tension on her face. Colette came last, her face serene, although her eyes betrayed a barely contained internal struggle. Poirot stood by the piano, as if conducting an invisible concert. He looked at each person before beginning to speak. "Thank you for coming. Tonight, with your permission, we will finally clear up the mystery of Madame Isidora Bellamy's death. But first, allow me to talk about music." A murmur arose. No one responded, but everyone was listening. "Music," Poirot continued, "is not only art, it is also memory. And in this house, where so many have remained silent for years, it was music that revealed the truth." He approached the piano and placed the score of Nocturne for an absent soul. This piece wasn't written for posterity. It was written as a legacy. A hidden message, not in words, but in notes, for an illegitimate daughter. A daughter Ambrose Bellamy had with Camille Laurent. Dorian shifted in his seat. "And what does that have to do with Isidora's death?" "Everything, Monsieur Bellamy. Because Isidora knew that secret. She'd known it for years. She hid it. She raised Ambrose's granddaughter as if she were a distant niece. But a few weeks ago, she feared the past would return. The music began to play again, and with it, fear, not of a spirit, but of the truth." Poirot turned slowly towards Lucien. "Vauclair, you, monsieur, found the letters. You knew it before anyone else. You knew that if Colette were recognized as the legitimate heir, her place and her inheritance would be lost. That's why you removed the page from the will she would have signed. That's why you didn't let her live to sign it." Lucien remained rigid. Only his fingers trembled slightly. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Mrs. Bellamy died of natural causes." "Ah, no," interrupted Poirot, raising a finger. "She died of poisoning with a compound that alters the heart rate. It leaves no obvious traces, but the wineglass I found had a residue that Dr. Giraud overlooked. You poisoned it, knowing that no one would suspect it." "That's absurd. There's no evidence." "No. The earring you dropped while you were snooping around in the night. The sheet music with your fingerprints on it. Exclusive access to the glass she used. And your trace of envy, monsieur. A trace that, believe me, can be heard even among the quietest notes." Lucien stood up abruptly, but Poirot raised his hand. "I'm not done yet." He turned to Mireille. "You found some of the letters. You knew some, though not everything. You entered the office seeking justice, not money. But your silence helped cover up the crime. You'll have to answer for that." Poirot finally looked at Colette. "And you, mademoiselle, have lived believing you were a shadow in this house. But you were the only real heir. Music didn't choose you by chance. It was yours from the beginning. There was absolute silence." Lucien sank back into the armchair, defeated, Dorian muttered something incomprehensible. Mireille looked down. Colette was barely breathing. Poirot closed the piano lid. The crime wasn't just the death of a woman. It was an attempt to silence a melody that belonged to someone who could never hear it. And so, with his little grey cells satisfied, Poirot left the room in silence, leaving behind a closed score, but a truth finally revealed. Chapter 11. Justice for a Lost Melody. The next morning arrived with a cleaner breeze, as if the air itself had been purged of an invisible weight. At Villa Nocturne, the silence was no longer the same. It wasn't oppressive, but expectant, like a curtain that has fallen after the climax of a play that had been suppressed for too long. Lucien Vauclair was arrested that same morning by the local authorities, who arrived at Poirot's summons. He offered no resistance. He only asked to take his coat and a bound copy of Ambrose Bellamy's memoirs, as if he needed a last refuge in the grandeur that had always surrounded him, but never belonged to him. Poirot, impeccable as ever, was sitting in the dining room, slowly eating his breakfast. Colette, sitting opposite him, was absent-mindedly stirring her tea without tasting it. "How did you know there was poison?" she finally asked without looking up. "I didn't know for sure until last night. But the symptoms you described, the anxious nights, the tremors, the irregular heartbeat, were not part of fear or age." The Chios poison took effect slowly. On the night of her death, Lucien served her wine, as always, and then he retired to his office, pretending everything was in order. And no one else knew, Mireille suspected, but she didn't imagine he would go so far. She thought maybe Isidora wanted to disinherit everyone, including her. That stirred her own uncertainty. Colette nodded, still absorbed. "And the music? What will you do with it?" Poirot placed the cup on its saucer. "That depends on you, Mademoiselle Bellamy." She looked up for the first time. "Bellamy? It's your legitimate name, isn't it? The will wasn't signed, but the documents and letters are enough to establish the truth. You are a direct descendant of Ambrose Bellamy, heir not only to his blood, but also to his legacy." Colette lowered her eyes again. "But I'm not a pianist, nor a composer. I'm not like him. Maybe not, but it doesn't have to be. Blood doesn't compel. It only reveals. You can decide what to do with that past. Maybe keep the music, or maybe transform it." A friendly silence fell between them. Poirot took the medallion he had found hidden in the piano from his inside jacket pocket. "This belongs to you." Colette took it gently. She opened it. She looked at the lock of hair, the wordless image that held more weight than any will. "It was my mother's, and now it's yours, as is this town, this story, this truth." There was a long silence before Colette spoke. "Last night, I played the piece again, very slowly, not like music, like phrases, and I understood something." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "What did you understand?" She smiled melancholy. "What? Nocturne for an absent soul?" "It wasn't written for an audience, not even for a daughter. It was written by a man who wanted to apologize, but never knew how to say it. The music was his apology." Poirot nodded gently, satisfied. "Sometimes, mademoiselle, the only thing a guilty person can leave behind is a melody." He finished his tea slowly, stood up, and with an impeccable gesture, tucked his shirt cuffs under the cuffs of his jacket. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I must catch the train to Paris. There's a tailor waiting for me with a waistcoat that's a day late. Unforgivable." Colette laughed for the first time in days. Poirot said goodbye with a slight bow. "Goodbye, Mademoiselle Bellamy, and remember, in music as in truth, what you don't hear is sometimes what matters most." And with that, he disappeared over the threshold, leaving behind the villa, the sea, and a melody that no longer needed to hide. Chapter 12. Epilogue. The House of Silence. 3 weeks had passed since Hercule Poirot's departure, and Villa Nocturne, though still shrouded in sea mist, no longer seemed burdened with secrets. The atmosphere had been transformed, not by renovations, but by the simple disappearance of fear. What had been an opaque sanctuary for resentments and unspoken truths now slowly breathed a form of redemption. Colette Bellamy, now without the surname Arnaud, had decided to remain at the villa. Not out of attachment to the property or inheritance, but for something more intimate, the desire to understand. She had Ambrose Bellamy's scores carefully restored and classified, not to publish them all, but to read them as if they were letters. Each bar spoke to her of a tormented, talented, and contradictory man, and among them the final piece, Nocturne for an Absent Soul, took on a new meaning. Lucien Vauclair had finally confessed under pressure. His crime hadn't been driven by hate, but by fear. Fear of being displaced, of losing the only place where his existence seemed to matter. He knew Isadora was leaning toward Colette. He knew his time as a confidential man was running out, and, in his desperate logic, he preferred to eliminate the heiress, rather than allow his own role to dissolve. Mireille Lemoine, after giving her statement to the police, left the villa. She left music behind, so it was said, and settled in Paris to start anew. She had confessed to Poirot, in a brief letter, that she felt complicit in a silence from which she was never able to escape in time. Dorian Bellamy also disappeared from the scene. He didn't fight the inheritance. He didn't challenge the invalidated will. He sent a single telegram. "I don't want anything. I've had enough with the last name." Poirot, upon receiving a copy of the message, read it with a raised eyebrow and murmured, "A belated gesture, but not entirely lacking in dignity." The Dion villa itself retained its soul. The grand piano was still where it always was, but it was no longer a symbol of a buried past, but an open window. One afternoon, Colette played the entire piece for the first time. The notes didn't feel sad or ominous, but profound, a tribute, a mutual forgiveness between generations that had never spoken. In his apartment in Paris, Poirot read Le Figaro Heil, sipping his perfectly hot coffee. Upon reaching the cultural section, he saw a brief note: "Ambrose Bellamy's unknown granddaughter will preserve his work at Villa Nocturne. Private concerts featuring his most intimate, never-before-heard compositions will be offered." Poirot smiled, folded the newspaper with pinpoint precision, and leaned back with satisfaction. "Harmony, at last," he murmured. "Even silences can be resolved into a pure note." With that, he closed his eyes for a moment. In his mind, the melody sounded again, not as a mystery, not as a lament, but as justice.